The following is a message from Crossroads Church, a grace-centered community in central Alberta, Canada.
You know, from time to time, we who talk up front confuse people, and of course we don't try to. And sometimes it's your fault, not mine, but sometimes people get confused, and apparently there were some confusions leaving here last week. Some people thought when I was talking about Haiti that I was in Haiti and my wife was traveling around Europe, and I just thought I would clear that up. What I actually said was, I said, we're on this little airplane on this little dirt grass runway, and we're about to take off, and there were a bunch of animals on the runway, and I wasn't fearful, but I was prayerful, and wondering if we were going to hit a goat as we tried to take off. And I said, you know, it's actually a win-win. I said, because if we actually make it, I'll have a great story. And I said, if I don't, Ginny will actually be, now here it is, mourning all the way around Europe. The idea being that she would have life insurance, she'd be able to mourn all the way around Europe. See, so she wasn't actually traveling Europe at the time. In fact, she doesn't have enough money to do that right now, right? You know, I have to die for that to happen. And as long as I'm here, we can go to Moose Jaw is kind of what it is. But actually, that's not bad. Have you ever been to Moose Jaw? They have mineral hot springs in tunnels. And, well, anyway, you should try Moose Jaw sometime. It's not as bad as you think. But I just thought I would clear that up, and I know that means nothing to most of you, but no, she was here, and I was in Haiti. I don't know what else I confused you with, but I'm sure you'll let me know as the weeks go on. I love coming and hearing commissionings like Curtis did, because it reminds me that God is incredibly at work in our world. Isn't that amazing that He's actually putting together a 24/7 prayer and worship place in Medicine Hat? Now, all places on the planet, Medicine Hat needs it. We know that. But, you know, to think that there would be a place where people could go or people could access and say, I need prayer, and 24/7 somebody would be there. That's a great thing. God is working. And then to think about North Korea, all the news I hear on my TV and radio is bad. But it's so good to be up here and hear that God is actually doing stuff with His people in North Korea, and doors are open and they can walk in. That's really good news. Like, God's at work, and I leave this place encouraged, don't you? But I was reminded this morning, listening to them the first time, that God is also at work here in Red Deer, in your life, on your street, at your workplace, at your coffee shop, as well as in North Korea and Medicine Hat. And I think part of our prayer should be, Lord, open our eyes to actually see what you're doing where we are. You ever pray that way? I was talking to my son last night. He's in Victoria, Rick, and he's a young adult pastor in a church there. And he said, you know, Dad, he said, we have these catalyst groups. Now, catalyst groups are just groups of young adults that they decided they would start reading the Bible on a daily basis. And so they read, and as they read, they journal. And then once a week, these little groups, they're piles of little catalyst groups, they come together at a Starbucks, 7 in the morning, on a weekday morning, and 4 or 5 of them, and they talk about what they're hearing from God, and then they pray. And it's really cool. He said, Dad, you won't believe what happened. He said, I was a few Tuesdays ago at a catalyst group at such and such a Starbucks, and he said, when we were done, one of the girls behind the counter jumped out and said, hey, were you guys reading the Bible? And he said, yeah, we were reading the Bible. And she said, I've heard that guy Jesus in the Bible tells incredible stories. Can you tell me one of the stories that he told? Rick said, actually, he does tell good stories. I got to go, but I'm coming back tomorrow morning. I'll tell you then. She said, great. He went back the next morning. She came out, sat down, and he told her the story about blind Bartimaeus. Do you know that story? About this blind guy? He's sitting at the side of the road, and Jesus comes by, and he said it would be like a street person outside your Starbucks, just sitting there, and Jesus comes by, stops, looks at the blind guy, and says, what do you want me to do? And you can imagine Bartimaeus saying, hello, my eyes, you know? And he said, I want to see. Well, she'd never heard that story, and she was blown away by it. And you ever been blown away by the stories of Jesus? Maybe we hear them too much if we're not, but she was blown away by it. So, a week later, he's back. and she jumped out from behind the counter, actually walked around, would be a better way of putting it, and said, "Hey, I was talking to my boyfriend about that story you told, and do you think, would it be possible for us actually to go to church and hear some more stories?" They'd never been to church in their life. They live in Victoria where there's churches everywhere. Never been to church in their life. He said, "Yeah, it's possible. In fact, why don't you and your boyfriend meet Jen and I on Sunday morning, such and such a place, and we'll take you to church." They took them to church. They're still going to church, and they're being wooed and drawn to Jesus. They love the stories of Jesus. What's funny was the first Sunday they were there, they were really into the worship, and it was really fun. And then the equivalent to Curtis got up and said, "We're the bag ladies." No, not the bag ladies. What did you say, Curtis? The ladies with the bags and the men with the bags. He said they're going to come up. And this girl looked at Rick and said, "I thought you told us church was free." She said, and he said, "Well, actually, you don't, it's not." But she's being drawn to Jesus. And I tell you that story for this reason. He's at work in your neighborhood. He wants to talk to the people that you interact with every single day. And I pray for me, and I hope you pray for you, that God would open our eyes to actually see what He's up to, because He's at work in our world. And that's what I'm discovering actually from the book of Daniel as I read it. That as I read this book, I discover that even when it doesn't look like it, God's at work. He is. All around us. Part of our job is to ask the Holy Spirit to discern where He's working so that we can work along with Him. Now today I want to take you to Daniel chapter 2. We looked at Daniel 1 last week, and I'm unapologetically saying this to you, that I'm actually slowly going to work through this book, and I think for the most part we'll go chapter by chapter, because I think most of us don't know the Bible well enough, and I just think I want to take you through the Bible and teach you the Bible. So we'll learn this book that most of us probably haven't read a lot. Let me just tell you, or summarize for you, what we talked about last week, because some of you weren't here and some of you forget, and it's just good to kind of be brought up to speed. But I tried to introduce the book last week by saying a very easy way to understand it is to just recognize it's divided into two parts. Daniel 1-6 is part 1, and that is made up of stories that are riveting, compelling. They draw you in. Part 2 is Daniel 7-12, and those are visions. So you have visions in the second part, stories in the first part. The visions kind of push you back. They're mysterious and they're rather hard to understand, but taken together, the stories and the visions address a very basic question that's important for me to know and you to know the answer to. The question is, how are God's people to live in an ungodly world? In other words, how are we as strangers to live in a strange land? The world's going this way, we're swimming upstream. How are we to do it? The stories say we're to do it faithfully. The visions say we're to do it expectantly. Now, if that's all you get out of the book of Daniel, you've got a big chunk of it, and it would change your life. We're to live faithfully and expectantly, in the sense that we are looking forward to Jesus coming and setting up His kingdom. Therefore, we are actually trying to live by the values of that kingdom now so that we're ready when it comes. So that's the book of Daniel in a nutshell. Daniel chapter 1, the theme was this: in spite of present appearances, God is still in control. It looked like God had washed His hands of these people. It looked like He had thrown them into Babylon and then walked out on them. But in actual fact, Daniel 1 said something very important for Daniel and his friends, and actually for you and me. That in spite of present appearances, God isn't absent. In fact, He's very much still around the place, very much still in control. Now, the other function of Daniel 1 is to set us up for Daniel 2. And it does so in a very interesting way. There's a line in Daniel chapter 1 about Daniel, and it says that Daniel, the end of verse 17, could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. That's an important statement, and it sets you up for chapter 2, and indeed the rest of the book. Because we'll find Daniel understanding visions and dreams and giving interpretations of them. So Daniel 1 sets up chapter 2, and I'll explain to you at the end how Daniel 2 sets up Daniel 3. And so when you're reading it, it makes sense. But I'd like to read part of Daniel 2. It's a long chapter, but I think I'll read the first 23 verses for you, and I can just reference the rest. But it's about a king's dream, and it's worth thinking through. It says, in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it. The king replied to the astrologers, this is what I firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I'll have you cut in pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you'll receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me. Once more they replied, let the king tell his servants the dream and we'll interpret it. Then the king answered, I'm certain that you're trying to gain time because you realize this is what I firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there's just one penalty for you. You've conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then, tell me the dream, and I'll know that you can interpret it for me. The astrologers answered the king, there's not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they don't live among men. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. Well, I thought what would be the best way to handle this would be just to take you through the story as it unfolds. And then at the end of the chapter, just tell you the big point that's been made and suggest a way that we might be able to live into the big theme of this chapter. So if that's appropriate, that's what I'll do. And I've tried to, just for your remembrance, and it's, almost lost my Bible. I thought I'd just alliterate the outline of the story. It's just easy to remember. I haven't done that for years because I used to work with a guy that always alliterated his sermons, and everything started with a P, and I was so tired of his alliteration I never did. But it helps me in this story to remember it. So the first part of this story just concerns God disturbing a king's sleep. Just God disturbing a king's sleep. It starts by saying Nebuchadnezzar in his second year had dreams and his mind was troubled. Eugene Peterson in his Message Bible actually says he was disturbed deeply by his dreams. Now the idea is that's painted here is that you have this king who's restless at night. And he's deeply disturbed by a dream that apparently keeps recurring. Now, in Nebuchadnezzar's day, when you had a dream like that, it was usually a sign that the gods were trying to talk to you, and apparently he took it that way. So this is Nebuchadnezzar, and he's having these dreams that disturb him, and it's apparent that God gave him the dream. God disturbed him. But God is just following down the tracks that Nebuchadnezzar's mind is already running on. And for example, a little later in the book or the chapter, Daniel says in verse 29, you were lying there on your bed, O king, and your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what's going to happen. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar would go to bed at night, and he would worry about his kingdom. He would wonder what was going to happen after he was gone. I mean, if you read about his kingdom, I'll read a verse later on about it. There's been no kingdom like it, really. Everything, including the birds, the animals, were put into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. He ruled over it all. And he would no doubt lie there at night wondering what would become of it all when he was gone, and perhaps how long he himself would reign. So it was down that track that God came with this dream that disturbed him. And his dream, he rightly interpreted as God or a God trying to talk to him. Now, that's why kings like Nebuchadnezzar had a whole gallery full of astrologers and magicians and enchanters. They were there to interpret dreams when the king had them. And in fact, you can read about this yourself, but the Babylonians, like the Egyptians, they're enchanters and astrologers and so on. They actually had dream manuals that were very articulate and well put together, and they would cover most of the dreams that the king would have, and then the interpretation. So when a king had a dream, he would tell the dream, they would interpret it, and life would be good. But the story moves to the second part where God disgraces, and I think that's the right word, the astrologers, enchanters, and magicians. You'll notice that the king calls them in, which is what normally happened, and he said, I've had a dream, I want to know the interpretation, and so their response was natural. Well, tell us the dream and we'll interpret it. The king said, no, I've made up my mind, it's going to work this way. I'm not going to tell you the dream, and you interpret it. You're going to tell me what I dreamt, and then you're going to interpret it. Now that was just lifting the stakes quite a bit. It seems to me that Nebuchadnezzar obviously didn't forget his dream. What was happening was this. It weighed on him so heavily. It was so significant that he wanted to make sure that he got the right interpretation. If he told them the dream and they came back with some interpretation, how would he know it was the right one? But if they actually nailed the dream, it's most likely that they would come in with a better interpretation. So that was his deal. Now they, of course, pushed back on that and said, no, that's not the way we work. Your job is to tell us the dream. We've been to school. Our job is to interpret it. But then he begins to ramp it up quite a bit more by saying, no, I actually firmly decided that if you don't tell me the dream, I'm going to tear you apart limb from limb. On the colors personality thing, he was probably blue. I'm going to tear you apart limb from limb and turn your houses into piles of rubble. That's what he said. But the flip side of that is if you get it, then you'll get lots of gifts and rewards from me. Well, they realize this is serious stuff, and they can't leave it there, so they come back one more time, and this is where the thing just explodes all over the place, verses 10 to 12. They say, look, there isn't a person on earth that's capable of doing what you're asking. And so he just says, I've had it done, you're dead. And throw the wise men into that pile too. So all the enchanters, magicians, sorcerers, and wise men in Babylon are going to be put to death. Now, he's a tricky man to work with, this Nebuchadnezzar. Well, they go, and so Daniel was looked for in his friends, and they finally caught up with Daniel, and I put God disgraced these astrologers because they were absolutely humiliated. Their research, their gods, their whatever, weren't powerful enough to actually come up with the dream and the interpretation. A question, this is a footnote, but that's often asked by those that read Daniel a lot and carefully and at a deeper level. They ask the question, well, where was Daniel? Why wasn't he part of the group that went to see the king in the first place? I mean, they think, according to chapter 1, he was part of that whole crew, and yet apparently in chapter 2, when these guys are negotiating with the king, Daniel's not around, and yet chapter 1 says he was 10 times smarter. So what gives? I think the easy answer to that is basically just this, that they don't read Daniel 1 carefully enough. If you read Daniel 1, this might not be important to you, but it's just a question that comes up. It says in verse 20, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. It doesn't say Daniel was part of that group. It just compares him and his friends with that group. If the text had said, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the other enchanters and magicians, then he'd be part of the group. But it doesn't say that. It just says he found them 10 times better. So he's comparing them, not saying Daniel's one of them. So Daniel wasn't part of the group. The king, though, when he explodes, decides that it's not enough to bring the roof down on the astrologers and enchanters and magicians. Let's throw the wise men into the pile too. That's why Daniel's brought into the mix. So you have Daniel entering the scene, and this is the part that's really intriguing, where God discloses the secret to Daniel. Daniel goes to the king, speaks with wisdom and tact, and he says, if you give us time, I think I can come up with the answer. And then what does he do? He doesn't panic. The next thing he does is he calls his friends together and he says, let's pray to the God of heaven and ask for mercy. And I stopped there and I thought, that's wise counsel for a lot of us in a crisis. In a crisis, the best thing you can do is gather your friends together that know God and seek God together. You know what most of us do? We panic or we take it into our own hands. But the best thing you can do is pray and seek God. That's what Daniel did. This was a crisis. I thought of, while we sit here, we have 14 people somewhere between here and Miami on the way to Haiti. They're going to land in Miami, and as far as I recall, they're going to stay overnight. Then they're going to go into Port-au-Prince, and they're going to drive to Haiti Rise and be there for some time. Excuse me, I take a drink for a minute of water. Always good to clarify. We're going to go to Haiti Rise. And I thought of 3 weeks ago when we were there. I thought of Mark and Lisa Honorat, who give leadership to Haiti Rise. I hope you know they're very, very special people. They don't have to be there, really. Mark's from Haiti. She's from Tacoma, Washington. They actually have a place in Airdrie, so I suppose they could be there. Or maybe they could go back to Washington. But they actually choose to live in Haiti. The place where they minister, where Haiti Rise is located, is 40 kilometers out of Port-au-Prince. But it's a 2-hour at least drive, and you literally take your life in your hands on that drive. Or maybe a better way of saying it was you literally put your life in God's hands when you drive that drive. It's terrible. And I thought of how many times they do that drive. All the inconveniences, all the risk, all the things that we have that they don't have. Don't always have electricity, don't always have hot water. Just, they don't always have what we have. You have to live behind walls. And I thought about the opposition that they sometimes face. We saw by the gate where someone had placed tires to try and burn it down when there was a problem. We were in their home one evening, and it's a comfortable home. But their home had also been attacked, violated as well at one point. And you ask the question, why do you live here? What strikes you about them is how confident they are in God. And I thought of our little series, Confident Living in Chaotic Times. How they persevere. I thought about their passion for Jesus. I was just reflecting on that this week, and then I remembered something that ties into Daniel in a crisis with his friends. You know, back in the summer, spring, when people were opposing them and trying to get in to Haiti Arise, and started a fire at the gate to try and burn it and get in. I thought how Lisa called her friends and said, pray. She called our church, maybe some of you personally, and said, right now we need prayer, we need mercy from God because people are trying to do this to us. And people prayed, and God turned the situation around. That's exactly what happens here in Daniel. It's a crisis. They stop, they pray, they seek God, and lo and behold, what does God do? He discloses the secret to Daniel. Only the God of heaven can do that. Now, what does Daniel do next? You know what I would do? I'd write it down, I'd break down the king's door and say, hey, it's okay, don't kill me. I got it. But Daniel, he takes time. Before he does that, he stops. And he says, I asked God, now I'll thank him. He says, praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He actually reveals deep and hidden things. I thank you because you've made known to me what we asked of you. You made known to us the dream of the king, and he actually worships and thanks God before he rushes into the king. I think what's important to note there is that it's not so much the content of the dream and the interpretation that he's praising God for as it is who God is. This is a God that can tell the future. He's worshiping a God that actually can tell you things to come. And it's this idea of this huge God that's greater than all the other gods that takes Daniel to his knees and he worships. And it's actually, the whole thing is drawn out greater in Isaiah 41, where in Isaiah 41, this battle between the real God and idols is set up. And the deal in Isaiah 41 is you'll always know the true God because he'll tell you things to come. An idol can never do that. And that's what's happening here. So then you get into the rest of the chapter, and basically it goes like this. You have the dream that Daniel tells the king that he had, and he's right, and then you have the interpretation of the dream. So let me just tell you what the dream was, and we'll think about what it means. The dream that the king had was actually awe-inspiring. It actually was frightening, I think, to the king. In fact, when you read the text, it's really interesting because it seems to me that this dream would have kept anybody awake. In verse 31, it says this about what the king saw. You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue. An enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. So every time his head hit the pillow and he went to sleep, this huge, incredible statue would appear in his dream. What did it look like? Well, if you tracked it through, the head of the statue is pure gold. And then the chest and what else? The arms were silver. And then as you worked down to the belly and the thighs, it was bronze. It had legs that were iron, and it had toes that were iron mixed with clay. It was weird. And I suppose if it had just happened maybe once, he would have thought maybe I had too much coffee. But as this thing recurred, it seemed to Nebuchadnezzar that this was significant. That's why the interpretation was important. But that wasn't the end of it. In his dream, he'd be staring at this thing when suddenly a rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, would appear, would blast its way across to the statue, hit the statue, pulverize it into dust, so there would be nothing left but a rock that then morphed into a mountain, which then filled the whole earth. Now, if you had that dream a lot, wouldn't you want to know what it means? Nebuchadnezzar wanted to know what it meant. So Daniel said, that's the dream you had. And Nebuchadnezzar was stunned. He recognized that Daniel got it. But Daniel got it from God. And then the interpretation. Now, here's the deal. There is so much ink that has been spilled on what this dream means. I think it's important to recognize that the dream concerns the future. Verse 43 says, or is it verse 45? It's verse 45. Says, the great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. So there's a key. This statue and this rock represents the future. Now, he says to Nebuchadnezzar this, you, Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold. That's you. That's your kingdom. And after you will come other kingdoms, represented by the silver chest and arms, the bronze belly and thighs, and the iron legs and toes, and so on. So you're the kingdom that's now. In the future, there will be subsequent kingdoms that come after you, ending up with this rock at the end that fills the whole earth and becomes a final, if you could put it that way, kingdom. So that's the interpretation of the dream. Now, I've read more stuff on this than you'd ever care to imagine. And I'm amazed at how confident people are in who these kingdoms are. They don't even say, this is what I think. They say this. They say, well, and it's given to us. Nebuchadnezzar is the first one. The second kingdom would be the Medes and the Persians. The third kingdom would be the Greeks. The fourth, the Romans. And then apparently there's this huge gap, and then Jesus comes, and that's, I think, a fair interpretation of the rock, sets up his kingdom that lasts forever. Now, that's the way most people will tell you the dream and its interpretation plays out. Now, my problem with it is this, and I'm almost embarrassed to say this. It seems so obvious. The text doesn't say that. So if it doesn't say that, I want to know where they get it from. And I don't know where they get it from, except they look at history and say, this must be the way it is. But I say, if I look at the internal evidence in the book, it might just be Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, and Cyrus. Could be them too. The way I understand it to be written is it's written purposely unclear and obscure. The only one that's given to you is the first, and really the last one is, because it's a rock not cut by human hands, and it's God setting up his kingdom. So you have Belshazzar today, and one day God setting up his kingdom, and all this stuff in between. But it doesn't tell you what it is. And it reminds me of this point that's a good one when it comes to biblical prophecy. Daniel's about prophecy. Revelation has some in it too. And other books of the Bible do. The deal about prophecy is that the Bible is more concerned with the goal, the end result, than addressing the questions of how and when. That's very important to know. Because most of us are obsessed, like most of the people that try and interpret this dream, with the how and the when and the who. Whereas the Bible's concerned about the end. It wants you to be crystal clear when it comes to prophecy that Jesus is coming back literally, physically, bodily. He really will set up a kingdom. It really will cover the whole planet. And one day, the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will be everywhere. That's the goal, the outcome. There's no doubt about that as you read the Bible. The problem is, we're not so concerned about that. We want to know how it's going to happen and when it's going to happen. And the Bible's deliberately unclear about a lot of that stuff. And so I think we need to learn that. The idea of bringing our lives now into line with what we know is coming is called wisdom, actually, in the Bible. That's why we're told the final outcome. So, I think I would just say this. It's very much like creation. The account of creation in the Bible is so brief. It just makes the point that God did it. But we come with the same questions of how and when that the Bible will not address. Frustratingly so, I think, for a lot of us. But it wants you to know that He did it so that it becomes the moral basis for Ten Commandment living. That's why the creation account's there. Not so that we'll figure out how. God could have done it any way He wanted, with any process He wanted, actually. He just wants you to know He did it. Same with prophecy. There's lots of details we would like to have filled in that the Bible will not fill in. So I got to tell you that before we're done, Daniel, I will let a lot of you down and disappoint you because I'm not going to give you a timeline because Daniel doesn't. I'll give you what Daniel gives us, but that's all I can basically give you. But having said all that, there are a couple or 3 points about this interpretation that are valid and are worth noting and are embedded in the text. Here's what they are. Number 1, human kingdoms decline as time goes on. That's part of the interpretation of the dream. Human kingdoms decline as time goes on. This is a massive statue, but it not only changes in value from head to foot, gold to iron and clay, But it changes in strength from the weight of gold, which is 10 times the weight of clay, and then silver, which is 5 times the weight of clay. So you see that however you break it down, what's happening here is that you have kingdoms in decline as things play out towards the end. When Jesus sets up his kingdom, they'll decline. Nebuchadnezzar's was the greatest of all time. If you look at verse 30, where is it? Verse 37. Daniel says, "You, O King, are King of kings. The God of heaven gave you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he's placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he's made you ruler over them. You are that head of gold." Now that's a deliberate look back to Genesis 1 and 2, where he makes man the ruler over the birds of the air and everything. Nebuchadnezzar lives up to that calling at this point. And that's why his head is the head of gold. There's been no kingdom like his, where everything's been placed in his hands. Babylon actually goes back to Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. It actually reappears towards the end, and you'll see that in the book of Revelation if you read it carefully. But it's the great kingdom. They all decline from there. You say, well, that's not so. Look at the progress and development around us. And I think at one level that's true. There's progress, there's development. But when you dig deep, you see decay and decline. We have improved means to unimproved ends. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that. We can speak to people today easily on any part of the planet, but we don't have anything important really to say. Isn't that interesting? We have improved means to unimproved ends. We can talk to anybody anywhere, but most of the time it's not substantive. I mean, I was going to pull off a few pages of Facebook posts and read them to you, but to make the point, but I just read your own. I mean, guess what I think about that? No. I'll tell you, I was reading one not so long ago from a friend in Calgary who posted that his baby just filled his diapers. We can talk to people anywhere, but what do we have to say? Somebody else said, well, I'm just sitting at the airport waiting to get on the plane. Well, good. What do you want me to do with that? We can travel rapidly from place to place, but make little progress in solving the problems of violence, war, famine, or liberation. We build fine houses, just drive through the city this afternoon, but have great difficulty building homes and families and marriages. It's easier to make a living today, a good living, than it was in Nebuchadnezzar's day, but try building a life. See, I think the dream is telling us that things actually decline and decay until Jesus comes up and sets an eternal kingdom built on the foundation of righteousness. Another thing I think this dream tells us is that it will be very difficult for things to hold together at the end of the age. It will be very difficult for things to hold together at the end of the age. The last kingdom was represented by these feet of iron and baked clay, which is really hard to bring together. And you think about the end of the age. I think what he's saying is things like treaties, covenants, contracts, obligations, commitments. It'd be very hard to hold them together and keep them. So you'll probably have countries defaulting on debts, obligations, commitments. You'll have treaties being broken. Contracts, even at the micro level of our lives, being walked out on. Covenants that people made before a holy God, just turning their backs on them. You will have great difficulty holding things together at the end of the age. Surely that's part of what God's trying to communicate here. Now, I think the other thing that's very obvious and hardly needs stating is that the vision does say, in the light of the New Testament, that Jesus will come back and set up his eternal kingdom. The rock is always a picture in the New Testament of Jesus. And a rock not cut by human hands is something God does. And a rock that obliterates all the other kingdoms and fills the whole earth. So you have this kingdom that never ends. Surely that's got to be God saying the day will come when I will send my son and establish my son as king over the whole earth. I mean, you can at least take that from this vision. So I think that's what the vision's about, and I think that's what it says, and I think that's what we need to take away from it. I suppose if you wanted another point to the story, you would end it by saying God distinguishes his servants. He disturbs the king in his sleep. He disgraces the astrologers. He discloses the secret, but he distinguishes his servant because when Daniel actually nails this thing, the king actually bows down to worship him. And the thing that troubles me about Daniel, although everybody says how godly and wise he is, and he accepts it. I mean, a lot of other people, godly men and women, that didn't accept it. Daniel seems to. And it actually says, oh, by the way, while you're giving me all this recognition, I've got 3 friends. Wouldn't you like to have a friend like Daniel? I would like them to get a promotion. So the king says, bring them in. He promotes them too. So you're being set up for some stories later in the book where you have Daniel and his 3 friends in very high positions because they got there through God revealing this dream to Daniel and the king rewarding them. So that's what happens there. So what's the big point in this chapter? I think it's this. I think the author, whoever it is trying to say to us that the sovereignty of Daniel's God is over and above everything. Daniel's God is sovereign even over kings. The greatest king on the face of the earth, to whom was entrusted all the peoples and the wildlife and the birds and everything of the planet. He's even sovereign over that king. You can't read this chapter without getting that God is sovereign. That means in control. It means nobody can trump him. But I think it's important to remember that he's our God, and we need to take that lesson to heart too. It's the part that we push back on, at least in our natural state before we knew Jesus, and even now, because if sovereign means control, it means he's in control and I'm not, and I push back on that way too often. I still want the right to determine how I'm going to live my life, where I'm going to live it, and who I'm going to live it with. But when you're dealing with a sovereign God who's working out his purposes, it means the bowing of my knees to him, and the prayer becomes really not my will, but your will be done. That's tough. How do you apply that? Well, when it comes to God's sovereignty, there's 2 things. One we'll look at this week and one next week. But the thing I want to just end with is this. The way you apply it is by humbling yourself before him. If he's sovereign, it calls for humility on my part, or a humbling of myself before him. How do you humble yourself before a sovereign God? Can I suggest 2 ways? One is this. It's by accepting our lot in life from him. It's easier said than done. I'll give you some illustrations. Sometimes we wish we were not who we were. Some people might wish they were thinner or had more hair or whatever. But we accept the deck that we've been dealt. Some people always struggle because they would rather be somewhere else rather than where it's clear God has placed them. Humbling yourself before a sovereign God means that he's determined the boundary lines for my life and I live within them. Some people wish they could be married to somebody else. And they spend a lot of their time coveting or lusting or thinking or just wishing. The sovereignty of God requires me to humble myself and love the wife that is, not the one that isn't. That's sovereignty and humility brought together. See, I don't know what it means for you, but some people say, well, my life is such a mess, and there's so much bad, and there's so much evil, and there's been so much sin. Sovereignty means that I trust that I can't do anything to trump his purposes, but I can bring the whole mess to him, and he can figure out a way to work it together for good. He can figure out a way to work out his purposes in the stuff of my life, even when I'm in over my head. The problem of evil is a problem that a lot of people wrestle with, and I think the answer to the question of why is there evil and why, if God is sovereign, it's all over the place, the easy answer to that is we don't know. We actually don't know why. What we do know is that evil won't have the last word, and what we do know is that God, through it all, works his purposes and even uses that for good in the establishment of his kingdom, if you can believe it. So, if God's sovereign, I humble myself at the level of saying, he's determined the time set for me, and the exact places I should live and who I should live them with, and I'll take that from His hand with gratitude, as opposed to always wanting something more, different. And I gave you a good illustration last week of that, a man in Haiti who had what we would say is relatively nothing, and yet accepts his lot in life in humility and just takes every opportunity he can with friends to thank God for all that he has. That's the kind of humility that's required when you worship a sovereign God. Then the other part about humility is this. You humble yourself when you accept your lot in life. You also humble yourself when you pray. 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray. It's not humble yourself, comma, and then pray. It's one thought, humble yourself and pray. To pray is to humble yourself. To not pray is to be God. To not pray is to say, I don't need God, I can do it myself. To pray is actually to acknowledge that I can't do this day without Him. So you pray, and it's a huge theme in this book. Daniel and his friends were men of prayer. They recognized God was sovereign, so in a crisis they prayed. And by the time you get to chapter 6, which Sean will take us through, you find Daniel's regular custom being to pray. That's crazy if you're dealing with a sovereign God, because we would think because any sovereign I know isn't accessible. You try and talk to President Obama this afternoon, or try and get a hold of Prime Minister Harper, or try and get a hold of somebody in power. It's usually convoluted and very, very difficult. But this sovereign at the center of the universe, this text screams at us, I'm accessible. I mean, Daniel and his friends can go to him and speak to him about issues in their life, and he answers them. So prayer becomes critical when you're dealing with a sovereign God. You pray to Him often that He would pray the same way Daniel did. Father, You're up to something in my home, in my life, in my world. Could you let me in on what you're up to? Could you show me what you're doing so that I can bring my life into line with what you're doing and live in your will and not in mine? And God is delighted to unfold His mind and thoughts when you pray with that kind of a humble heart, because you want to follow Him and walk in His footsteps. He's a very accessible God. So accessible that He sent His Son Jesus Christ, that absolutely anybody, anywhere on the planet, could come into His direct presence at any time through Jesus. Jesus said, I've come to bring you life and life to the full. And He said, I am the way and the truth and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. The flip side is everybody can come to the Father through me. So He's very accessible, this God. So that's, I think, what you do when you're dealing with a sovereign God. You first humble yourself, and then you set yourself to talk to Him, and to get in on what He's doing, because He's accessible as well as sovereign. Next week, I want to talk to you about the other thing that you do with a sovereign God, and that is that you worship Him. Chapter 2 sets up chapter 3 like chapter 1 set up chapter 2. Because in chapter 3, you have this imposter God being set up that is supposedly sovereign, that they're all to worship, but Daniel and his friends don't. But that's for another day. As it is, my time is done, and so let's stand and pray and then worship God. Father, thank you that you don't change, that in actual fact, you are as in control of our world and our lives today as you were in Daniel's day, that you still set up and take down, you still change times and seasons, you still reveal mysteries, you still are found by those that seek you. And we want to thank you today that though you're sovereign and above all, yet you're completely accessible, so much so that when we come into your presence in Jesus' name and call you Father, you know everything that there is to know about us, even the hairs on our head, when we sit down and when we get up, what we're concerned about, the motives behind what we do. So, Father, in your presence today, we just humble ourselves before you and thank you for the boundary lines that have fallen for us in pleasant places. We pray that you would teach us to be content with what you've given to us, and that you would teach us to seek you. I pray today the things that are of your Spirit you'll plant in our hearts, and the things that aren't you'll blow away. For we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.